Welcome back to Grace Abounds. We're in part 3, episode 3 of our series on the opioid abuse crisis and how the church is called to respond to this crisis. We have with us today Mr. Troy Olmsted, who is the Vice President of the Board of Directors of the Wisconsin Recovery Community Organization. And we'll be talking with Troy today about the recovery community, but also about the experience of people who have suffered from opioid use disorder. Now, if you'll recall, in our first episode, we just basically talked about the overall history of the opioid abuse crisis, where it has come from, how it has grown, what some of the dimensions and contributing factors have been. As we've moved forward, we've also spoken with law enforcement officers to talk about what they're seeing on the ground, so to speak, in terms of sufferers from opioid use disorder and people whose lives are affected by people around them who are suffering from opioid use disorder. Today we're going to talk more specifically about the experience of sufferers themselves. And as we move on, we'll be talking about options in recovery, resources in recovery, the response of faith-based organizations, particularly churches, but also parachurch organizations, to reach out to people, to welcome them into churches, to rebuild and re-knit communities together. But we're going to start out today by asking Troy to basically tell us a little bit about yourself to start with.
Morning. So my name is Troy Olmsted, and I'm from Sheboygan, Wisconsin. I've suffered from drug addiction from a pretty young age, off and on. Mostly started with recreational drugs and then marijuana, LSD, drugs that were more of a group fun thing to do, as the way we found it, I guess. And then moved into more alone drugs. Cocaine was my drug of choice. I'm a machine builder, millwright, journeyman, and as you mentioned, vice president of WIRCO, Wisconsin Recovery Community Organization.
Okay, Troy, I'd like to pick up on one point you just raised. You were talking about marijuana or LSD and talking about group use, recreational use. And then you switched and talked about individual use. You gave the example of cocaine. If we talk about opioids, if we're talking about heroin or pills, is that a group thing or is that more of an individual thing?
No, that's more of an individual thing. Mm-hmm. I think in general a lot of people start with drugs that they use with friends and drinking and things that are done more in social circles, whether right or wrong. Say LSD is all fun and people do it in groups and they sit around and laugh at stuff. And as we start to isolate for whatever reason because of our depressions or whatever it is we're trying to get away with or from, people tend to go to those types of drugs that you do by yourself so you can isolate further by yourself. And opioids are by nature downers, and they have people more of a vegetative state that they can just sit there kind of numb and not feel what's really going on in their mind.
Okay, when I was in college, I remember one of the jokes that people who were into recreational drugs would say was, reality is just for people who can't take drugs. Because at the time there was a government campaign that was basically saying drugs are just for people who can't take reality. But you mentioned the factor of depression there and the factor of individualism, let's call it, or maybe isolation even. Is there something unique about the use of opioids that tends to attract particular personality traits, or is it a chicken and an egg situation here? Does the drug isolate people, or do isolated people tend to gravitate towards opioids?
Well, I think from what I've seen is that it does not discriminate. There's people in all different social backgrounds and statuses and that sort of thing that are going to the opioids mainly because or beginning with prescription medication from some trauma. Mm-hmm. So you can have a person that is depressed go into that cycle to further isolate from people and deal with their own whatever it is they're dealing with in a self-medicated way. You can also have somebody that's very outgoing and hangs out in large social circles and has a large social life become dependent on, say, pills or something like that, and then go into the heroin to satisfy the need from the pills, which then causes them to isolate.
You mentioned in your own case originally getting into drug use on a recreational basis. In your experience with recovery community organization, how common is it for somebody who didn't start out in a recreational use but originally was prescribed an opioid for pain to become dependent on the drug?
I think that's very common now. Unfortunately, a lot of people that go through some sort of trauma and need pain management end up on some sort of narcotic through a doctor. And as the body needs that, and it no longer becomes available from the pharmacy, the alternative is to go find the easy stuff to find, and heroin has become a lot more easy to find than prescription medications.
Can you describe, with reference to some of the people you've worked with, what we're talking about when we say somebody's trying to avoid being drug sick?
Yeah. Opiate abusers or users, their bodies need that drug. They start to crave it, and they will get diarrhea. They'll get shakes, they'll vomit. There's a lot of different side effects from use and abuse of opiates. But a lot of people will be tired all the time. They'll be just kind of zombied.
And so, quite rationally, they want to avoid that, so they're going to go get more drug. At what point in the life of a sufferer from opioid use disorder does it become more likely that somebody's going to seek an illegal drug like heroin or fentanyl, or a prescription drug without a legitimate prescription?
As soon as it's not available in the form that they were given before. So if a person has, say, Vicodin or Oxycontin or something for a serious back ailment, and their doctor says that's enough of this because your prescription's always missing, you're always needing it refilled earlier than what it is, and they say we're not giving it out anymore, or just because you've been on it so long, because your body has come to that point that it now needs it and you are getting sick without taking it, they'll go out then and find the easy alternative, which is heroin.
Okay, and obviously it's easy for somebody in that situation to be victimized. They could receive a drug that has other stuff in it. They could be ripped off in a transaction. But how common is it for somebody who is dependent on drugs to actually start dealing themselves?
That's a fairly easy transition, and I've been in that point myself. As we're using drugs, if somebody went from prescriptions to non-prescriptions or illegal prescriptions, they have to find a way to be able to pay for them now. And most of that is finding the easy money. So they start stealing from friends or family. Maybe they have a nice savings account that they deplete. They start selling stuff off, and they also go to dealing drugs before they start selling their own stuff off. Mm-hmm. For myself, I got into dealing so that I could support my own habit. So.
Mm-hmm. Is that common in opioid use disorder for people to support their own habit by dealing?
Yes, and if you watch all of the people that are being charged in, say, heroin-related deaths, most of them people are people that went out and bought 2 bags and sold one to their buddy and did the other one themselves. Mm-hmm. So they might go to Milwaukee or some other area and buy it at a much cheaper rate, sell the 1 bag to their friend, and now theirs was free.
Okay, so let's assume for a minute that I'm dealing drugs because I have a habit. If I'm in fact arrested, am I going to get any drug treatment in most cases?
That's the million-dollar question. It's a changing world out there right now, and I think some of the perception is changing. If you go to prison and you were selling drugs, you're not going to get treatment for it. You'll only get treatment if you were a user. The treatment courts in Sheboygan would more than likely set you up in some sort of program to maybe discourage it and hopefully break that cycle. But opiate's a tough cycle to break.
In my experience, some of the folks we've worked with who have gone through drug court, for example, they've been put into a residential rehabilitation facility for anywhere from 30 to 60 days. Is that time frame effective in an opioid addiction?
No, I believe it needs to be longer for the opioids. I did a 120-day residential program while I was incarcerated for cocaine abuse. And the people that were in there that had opioid abuse problems were probably needed longer than that yet. Mm-hmm. It's the hardest drug to detox and recover from just because of the hold that it has over your body and the sickness part of it.
Mm-hmm. When somebody is dependent on the drug, and as we've talked about, this tends to isolate them, what happens in terms of their community network, a group of people around them who can help?
Well, they'll start to see signs. The person starts to withdraw further and further from them. They make excuses not to be there, probably just not showing up or being missing, and they'll notice their spending habits and things like that will change. The person themselves will be less involved in family activities or social outings that they would normally participate in.
Mm-hmm. Can somebody who is drug dependent recover on their own?
Well, on a drug dependent, yes. In some cases they can, depending on the type of drug. Mm-hmm. In most cases, say with opioids or even cocaine, it's really not, it's very rare that people can do it on their own. There has to be some sort of detox period followed by some sort of treatment period, and then finally by a network afterwards, a support system to stay clean.
So what kind of barriers exist if somebody's drug dependent, if they're an addict? What kind of barriers to recovery exist for that person?
Well, that's one of the things we're working on. Right now stigma is huge. People refuse to do it because of the stigma associated with it. So even though the stigma is about the drug use themselves or the drug usage itself, when people are part of an intervention, they get defensive, they feel shamed. Mm-hmm. And they don't want that attention being right on them saying, you're an addict, this is what you have to do. It becomes very overwhelming. I know personally I've had interventions attempted on myself, and I didn't want any part of it. It was confrontational, and then I had to admit to everybody that I had this problem that I could not control. So one of the ways to get around that is to reduce the stigma and say, it's okay, I'm an addict, I need help. And there's a whole network of people out there that will help them if they can get over that point of saying, I'm too scared, or I don't want this person to know that I'm an addict.
Okay, so let's talk about faith-based organizations, a church in particular. If we have a member of the church who's an addict, and we don't want to do an intervention and get in their face that way, if they haven't self-identified and said, I'm an addict and I need help, what can church members do to walk alongside somebody and support them in recovery or steer them towards recovery?
So peer support has become a big thing in this country, and it's gaining a lot of momentum and has proven or shown very promising results. More of a personalized kind of a friendship. I understand we share the same life experiences. Tends to be working right now. So if you had a person, a member of the church community that you thought was having an issue with drugs, simply a heart-to-heart talk in a non-confrontational way, because once you confront them on something or they feel confronted and backed into a corner, they'll shut down.
Mm-hmm.
So simple pat on the back, look, we've noticed something's been wrong, something's different with you. And we have some concerns, and we want you to know that there's a lot of people out in this world that suffer from different things, whether it's anxiety, depression, or drug abuse. And looking at some of the signs of drug abuse, we think that maybe you have some issues, and we'd like to be there for you and help you along the way and direct you into maybe some services that could be helpful to you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so very much a walk alongside, care about somebody. What I'm hearing there as well is a very non-judgmental approach. An approach which isn't saying, hey, you've got a problem, but an approach which is saying, you're a member of the body of Christ here and we're noticing something different. How do we get healthy together?
Correct.
Is that a fair characterization of what might be helpful?
That would be. And of course, there's going to come a time then that once that dialogue started, that you're going to have to kind of direct them into a line of care.
Mm-hmm.
Once they've admitted that maybe there is something there. Oftentimes a person will say, oh yeah, I'm using a little bit here and there, but I got it under control.
Mm-hmm.
But once you get through that initial conversation, then it's how do we get you to the next level of care, and how do we get you to completely stop this behavior and become your old self again.
Well, Troy, we've talked about barriers to recovery. We've talked about how churches can work with people in recovery. There are a lot of different models in recovery. There are traditional 12-step models, AA, NA. There's the recovery community organization model that is less focused on anonymity. Are we seeing any change in how people by age group are responding in recovery now?
Yes, and based on drug of choice. We're finding that the peer-based models are more effective in the younger people than, say, the older generation, and that some of the typical programs that we're used to are not as welcoming to the drug user or a person coming out of incarceration. And so I think that the shift that we've seen going around the country is more into the peer-based recovery.
Okay, it's certainly been traditional for a lot of 12-step groups to sort of nest in a church. We have an AA group in this church, for example. There's an NA group down the block. If a church wanted to work more in a peer-based model, if a church wanted to reach out to younger people who are having problems with drug dependence, how would we go about doing that?
Just finding an organization that does it, like Weirco.
Mm-hmm.
We do recovery coach-based programs.
Mm-hmm.
And mentoring. And you can do it within the church itself with other parishioners and just generally informing people on how to be nice to a person that has an addiction and making them feel welcome.
Could you see a time when an organization like yours would provide recovery coaching training for churches?
Of course.
Okay.
We're not worried about where somebody is or what group they belong to or where, what area they're in. Our concern is reaching the person that needs us or that needs help. And as a recovery coach, it's not about me, it's not about my religious beliefs, it's not about whether I believe the 12 Steps model or the Celebrate Recovery model or any other model that's out there. It's about what that individual person needs to get out of that life trauma that they're in.
Okay, you just said if I was talking to an individual sufferer as a coach, I want to figure out how to reach him. So I'm going to ask you if you could say one thing to somebody suffering from opioid dependence. What would be the one thing you'd say to them to start with?
Loaded question. A lot of times it depends on the situation, but generally speaking, it's a vicious cycle that is never going to get better until you get out of it. And it's going to get deeper and deeper and deeper before you come back up to where you once were. And during that time that you're going down, you're losing friends, social status, family, employment, and it takes a long time to recover from it.
Okay. And we'll wrap up then with the final question, which is if you could say one thing to a church about working with people in recovery, particularly for opioid dependence, what would you tell us?
That you have to keep an open mind to the individual and the addiction itself. People don't try to become an addict. Nobody says, I'm going to be an addict when I get older. It happens to good people. It happens to bad people, if there is a bad person. So just be patient. Don't give up on somebody.
Well, thank you for ending us on that message of hope. Join us again next week as we continue this series, and we'll be a little bit more technical next week, talking to some alcohol and drug dependence counselors from the medical and mental health perspectives to get their viewpoints on what recovery looks like and how organizations like churches, how faith-based communities can reach out to people and provide some of the resources and recovery capital necessary for them to live into this vision of new life and hope. We'll look forward to being with you again next week. God bless. Thank you, Troy. That was good.
Thank you.
Yeah.